I'm Dr. Nathaniel Chin, and you're listening to Dementia Matters, a podcast about Alzheimer's disease. Dementia Matters is a production of the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Our goal is to educate listeners on the latest news in Alzheimer's disease research and caregiver strategies. Thanks for joining us. Welcome back to Dementia Matters. Today we have a slightly different episode to share with you. Having published nearly 200 episodes, we've covered a lot of topics on the podcast, from research studies on dementia prevention and detection to clinical trials and caregiving strategies. So today, instead of doing a traditional interview-style episode, we're going to do a compendium, best of episode, highlighting some key information we've shared about the 6 pillars of brain health. The 6 pillars of brain health is a way for our Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center to organize what we feel are key lifestyle interventions with an evidence base for improving brain health and overall health, and will hopefully delay the onset of cognitive impairment or reduce the risk of developing it. Other places may use a different phrase, but I believe most would agree with our list, which consists of exercise, restorative sleep, a healthy diet, cognitive stimulation, social engagement, and stress management. Brain health is not about the presence or absence of disease. It is about living your best life with optimal brain ability for as long as possible. Research is showing we have more power than previously thought in keeping our brains healthy. And so, we need to know what lifestyle factors matter and then make the decision to act. We've picked clips from 6 past episodes to highlight and review the research that's been done on these pillars. We'll start by sharing a bit about exercise and physical activity in an excerpt from an interview with Sarah Lowe's and Max Gatan, before moving into a clip focused on the mind diet with the late Dr. Martha Claire Morse. After that, we'll have an excerpt from an interview about the importance of sleep for a healthy life with Dr. Steve Barzy. Then Dr. Vinny Manicchiello will discuss mindfulness and how it can relate to stress management. Finally, to wrap up this episode, we'll learn about what cognitive engagement is from an interview with Dr. Kim Miller before hearing about the impact of social engagement and social isolation from Dr. Allison Wong. Timestamps for when each pillar section starts and links to the complete episodes referenced will be available in the show notes if you'd like to hear specific parts or learn more. We'll jump right in to learn the importance of physical activity. You'll hear a bit of our theme music to help separate each topic, but I'll be back at the end to share some closing thoughts. For now, please enjoy as we review a bit about the 6 pillars of brain health. What is the difference between exercise and fitness, and where does physical activity fit into these concepts?
Well, exercise is really a behavior, while fitness is a characteristic of the body. And in terms of physical activity, it's also a behavior, but there is a distinction that's really important between physical activity and exercise. And that is that physical activity is anything that you do to move your body, whereas exercise is structured and repetitive and an intentional behavior.
So physical activity is the general broad category, and you would say exercise fits underneath that specific one?
Exactly.
And so a person can be, if you're exercising, you're having physical activity, but it doesn't work the same way. Physical activity may not always be exercise.
That's correct. And it's a really important distinction because exercise is known to have specific benefits to the body and to health and to the brain that physical activity doesn't necessarily have.
One of the main arguments for physical activity in the world of Alzheimer's disease is its potential to contribute to resilience, or what we refer to as a cognitive buffer. So if you could share with us what is meant by this term buffer and resilience, and what it means to an aging brain.
So what we mean when we talk about resilience or cognitive buffer, first we need to understand that Alzheimer's disease, there's different pathology going on in the brain, so we have increase in proteins, but then there's also the clinical aspect where we see symptoms occurring. And what we have found in some autopsy studies is that people will have these proteins in the brain, but they never showed any of these symptoms that we would see. So from that, what we were able to kind of think about is that some people are able to handle these proteins being in their brain and not show the symptoms. So there's something there that either delays the onset or can change the course of the disease itself. And there's things such as sleep, diet, social engagement, engagement, physical activity or fitness, brain engagement, things like this that may be related to this resilience.
So then what does the literature currently show for things like exercise and brain health?
Well, it in part depends on what population you're talking about. So, for example, there seems to be great benefit for people who have normal cognition in terms of even improving, say, executive function, which is a specific part of cognition. But we also know that across the board, across all populations, that exercise increases blood flow, which is really good for the brain, that it increases brain plasticity, which is how the brain cells and neurons talk to each other. We also know that it seems to be important for an exercise program to improve someone's fitness to actually deliver these changes to the brain. And so originally studies would examine these cognitive changes after just one bout of exercise. But then researchers started looking at more longitudinal changes, so they would do exercise interventions and then measure cognition before and afterwards. So it's not just one exercise session, which is good, although that's true. It's really the cumulative effect over time that seems to be most beneficial.
But I noticed that you didn't mention memory as a potential benefit. So has exercise not shown a specific benefit for our memory function?
A recent study that came out just a few weeks ago showed that an exercise training program of about 1 year increased the size of the hippocampus among people at risk for Alzheimer's disease. The hippocampus is the memory center of the brain.
And we've actually found in our own center as well that individuals, as they age, we can see benefits to physical activity on their memory scores and, again, this hippocampus. So we broke people up into physically active and physically inactive, and those who were physically active had a greater hippocampus volume. They also had higher memory scores compared to their inactive peers.
Is there a particular activity that is better for the brain than another one?
At this point, what we can say is that studies that exist right now and from our lab show that a moderate intensity activity is sufficient. But it's really about repetitive and continuous motion. And so a great example of that is walking. Getting out for a 30-minute walk is absolutely perfect. If you can't get out for a full 30 minutes, we do know that about 10 minutes at a time is necessary to show benefit. So it's best to do bouts of at least 10 minutes throughout the day.
And to add on to that, with the research that has been done, most of it follows the American Heart Association guidelines, and that's going to be 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity exercise. So you can think about going out for a walk at moderate intensity, 30 minutes, 5 days a week. And that's all that we're asking for.
So then, Sarah, can you define for us what moderate intensity means?
Absolutely. So a great way to think about intensity is getting your heart rate up. And one way that we can measure this easily and kind of arbitrarily is something that we use called the talk test. So if you are exercising and you can sing, you are at a low intensity. Okay, your heart rate's kind of up, but not too much. If you can talk but not sing, then that means that you're at more of a moderate intensity. So again, your heart rate's up even higher at this point. And then if you can talk only a couple of words at a time before having to take a breath in, you're working at more of a high intensity, so your heart rate's even higher.
What is the Mind Diet?
We created the Mind Diet when we were about to seek funding to do a randomized controlled clinical trial of a diet to lower one's risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And we at first were going to use the Mediterranean diet, but then it occurred to me, why would I ignore 20 years of research into the foods and nutrients that we knew were important for the brain? So the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diets are both very well-rounded diets that have been vigorously tested and shown to be important for keeping one healthy, especially from cardiovascular conditions. So we modified the basic components of the Mediterranean and the DASH diet to incorporate the nutrients that we knew were important for the brain. So that's why we call it the Mind Diet. the Mediterranean DASH intervention for neurodegenerative delay. That's quite a mouthful.
Yeah. Now, could you tell us specifically what that diet entails?
There's 10 food groups that we recommend people to incorporate. And then there's 5 foods that are not so brain healthy that we suggest people limit. Not necessarily take out of the diet, but reduce those foods. So among the healthy food groups are extra virgin olive oil, green leafy vegetables, other types of vegetables, berries, whole grains, seafood. 1 seafood meal a week is sufficient. Chicken, 2 or more servings per week. Beans and other legumes, and nuts. So those are the 10 healthy food groups. And then the foods to limit would be fried and fatty foods, sweets and pastries, butter and trans fat type margarines, whole fat cheese, and red meat and red meat products.
And when you say limit, I like that you say limit because you're not saying you can't have these things. And your science has shown, even if you follow this diet moderately, we still have benefit.
Yes. In 2015, we published 2 studies about the MIND diet. One showing that the MIND diet, people who adhered closely to the MIND diet pattern had a 53% reduction in the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And even those people who only moderately followed the diet, they had a 35% reduction in the risk of developing Alzheimer's. And then we had a second publication where we looked at the rate of decline in people's cognitive abilities over time and found that people who were on the MIND diet had significantly slower rate of decline in their cognitive abilities.
And I must say, in my clinic, I'm always talking to my patients about the MIND diet. And one of the things that they provide feedback to me with is the fact that they don't have to do it 100%. Change is hard. Lifestyle change is the hardest.
It is.
But knowing that they can make these small changes and eventually get to this 100% goal, but knowing the small changes makes a big difference for them. I also wonder, with the MIND diet, is this a feasible diet across all socioeconomic levels?
I get that question asked a lot, and I haven't done an analysis of what the cost would be for this diet versus a usual westernized diet. People think that these healthier diets are more expensive, and I'm just not seeing it. But I imagine it depends also in how accessible these foods are depending on where you live and whether you have to travel a far distance to get to a store that would have these food items rather than walking out your door and there's a Kentucky Fried Chicken right there.
Right. I like how you say, minus the accessibility, but if you're already in the grocery store, your diet allows for us to reallocate what we would have spent on junk food, on red meat, which is not cheap, and put it into something that is healthier. My patients have not complained of prices. They do say that salmon can be expensive, but otherwise they have said, well, I really stick to the outsides of the grocery stores, and I haven't changed as far as my grocery budget.
I'm glad to hear that.
And it's a matter of prioritizing, so they'll still get the cheese curds because you're never going to convince a Wisconsinite I'm not doing that, but it's a matter of them saying, well, I'm not going to get the bag of chips. Instead, I'll get the salad. What does poor sleep mean?
So it'd be good to start out by thinking of why is it that we need to sleep? Because that's one of those age-old questions. And maybe 20 or 30 years ago, there was a lot of speculation about the purposes of sleep. Now we have a much better understanding with lots and lots of research work that's been done. So I think it's fair to say that sleep has a restorative role. It helps us to physically feel better But beyond that restorative role alone, it has several other important roles, if you will. Number one, it helps us with regards to consolidation of memory. So we're starting to learn, and actually it's been in the last 15 years, that certain aspects of sleep help us to consolidate certain things that we remember from the preceding day. So we learn new information, we experience new things, we might even have emotional kinds of events that occur. And our brain has to process that information, and it has one of several ways it can do so. Number one, it can disregard it. I'd like to use an example that we don't remember, I certainly don't remember, what I had for breakfast 3 weeks ago. It's not useful information, and so my brain has decided to get rid of it. On the other hand, if some important life event occurs, like a family member has a baby or a health issue comes up or someone dies, those are big life events that usually imprint us. And those kinds of events tend to be reinforced in deep or slow wave sleep. So our brain has a way of pruning out some of the information that's not so important and storing or reinforcing the neural connections or networks during sleep for more important information. So that's, you can imagine, would be very important for this whole issue of dementia. Additionally, it helps us with regards to regulating certain emotional events and responses. So everyone here probably can appreciate that if you have a really bad night's sleep or hardly sleep at all, the next day you're a little bit more prone to kind of be inflammatory to others or say things you shouldn't normally say. And so this way of regulating emotional response is also, it turns out to be an important kind of piece of sleep. We also know that sleep has a role on the whole body's maintenance. So, for example, people who sleep poorly generally experience more problems with elevations in blood pressure, for example. So these are all really important tasks. Now, to get back to the very first point you made, which is what does it mean to have poor sleep? It may mean different things depending on how you approach it. It could mean that by having poor sleep, you feel worse in some fashion. You may not be as mentally sharp, you may be just more dragged out, you may have a headache, so there may be a subjective feature. Then there's also what we can measure in a laboratory or otherwise, and that would be the rhythm of their sleep through the night is not a natural one where they go into deep sleep and then they go into dream sleep and they go into other phases of sleep through the night. Then that could have more physical factors that we may not immediately notice, but it might have a subtle impact upon the attention or our ability to retrieve information the next day. And only when we're really measuring it with technical, kind of testing, would we pick that up. Poor sleep or good sleep, it's both subjective, but it also has an objective kind of or measurable effect that we can dig into.
Well, then, knowing how important sleep is, what can contribute to poor sleep?
There's a long, long list of things, but try to summarize in broad categories. We know that if a person has a lot of stress in their life, there's a lot of emotional things going on in their life, then their mind can become very active. And sometimes it's hard to turn their mind off when they put their head on that pillow at night. And so there's a lot of events in the day that can set us up for a poor night's sleep. There might also be activities or habits that we do that could be maladaptive for sleep. So drinking a cup of coffee right before bedtime for some people can be a problem. There are many different health problems that can contribute to poor sleep. So anyone who's having any kind of pain, chronic pain, or might have breathing difficulties, shortness of breath from a heart problem, or might have difficulties with other things like high blood sugars, causing a person to have to run to and from the bathroom during the night. So these are all examples of medical conditions that can interfere with sleep quality. If we keep moving along, many of the medications that we prescribe for some of these issues can sometimes have a negative effect on sleep. Then there are a number of psychiatric or psychological factors. So I mentioned stress, but more specifically things like depression and anxiety. In the veterans population, post-traumatic stress disorder. These are examples of conditions that will also have very specific ways they disrupt sleep. And then we finally get to a list of some of what I call the primary sleep disorders. And so that's usually what people think of first. But I want to emphasize that those other things that I've mentioned just previously can oftentimes be much more common and much bigger deal.
In my clinic, a lot of people will ask how much sleep should they be getting. And I know that as we get older, our sleep patterns can change. What do you say to patients?
So, first off, there's a population curve, meaning that if you look at a whole bunch of people in the population, you'll find people who are short sleepers. These are individuals now that may still need 6.5 hours of sleep, but 6 to 6.5 hours of sleep is more than ample for them to feel regenerated, and we don't see that they have a sleep debt afterwards. We can measure that with certain types of testing. On the other hand, there are some poor, unfortunate souls out there who literally need 10 or 11 hours of sleep, or they will feel exhausted and tired and not with it. Because it's a bell-shaped curve, meaning, there's a peak in the middle, most of us probably need somewhere around 7 to 8 hours of sleep. But as far as meeting one's needs, the basic, most simple way to figure out if you're meeting your sleep need is, are you experiencing tiredness the next day? Now, assuming you don't have a sleep disorder, you may just not be getting enough sleep for your body. And so if you're finding that on weekends you sleep in, you sleep longer, and you feel better, then you are in sleep debt.
We hear a lot of talk about mindfulness. So to begin, how do you describe mindfulness to someone?
So when I talk about mindfulness with people, I think it's important to understand that there are many different ways to describe mindfulness. I think on reflecting on this question, what comes up for me is that it's a practice that involves choosing to bring awareness to the present moment with a quality of kindness in our attention. And so often this mindful attention might come in the form of a simple pause or a breath, or sometimes it can come in the form of an extended practice. So that can be done sitting or lying down, standing, walking, or through other forms of movement. One other piece that I think is really important to mention is that out of this pause, whatever form that pause takes, we might begin to see in a different light our relationship to ourselves and to those around us. And through recognizing or just simply being aware of this relationship, we then might choose to respond to ourselves or respond to others around us in a way that is perhaps healthy as well as compassionate.
That's a wonderful explanation, and thank you for sharing that. And I do hope our listeners can rewind and go back over that, because that is one of the most thoughtful and comprehensive ways of looking at it. I do wonder if you can share with us how mindfulness works. How does it affect our body?
It's fascinating research, and this is research that's been going on for decades now. And what I'll share is just really tip of the iceberg. A few of the things kind of specifically that the research has pointed to, different areas. One, altering brain activity. People have shown that through functional MRIs, there's actually the prefrontal cortex actually gets activated more. And specifically, one of the areas that has been shown to be activated more is the left anterior cerebral cortex, and other areas of the brain that are linked to positive mood. There's also an increase of activation in the brain attention centers. In addition to brain changes, we actually see a lot of changes in different biomarkers, so different signals of inflammation or stress in our body. So noting that through mindfulness practice, there are changes in cortisol levels, C-reactive protein, TNF alpha. These are different factors that can be related to markers of stress. In addition, we see through mindfulness practice that there can be changes to blood pressure, to heart rate.
Now, what's your recommendation for someone wanting to start a mindfulness practice? And where does one begin?
So this is an excellent question. And so I just bringing my clinical experience forward, I like to meet people where they're at. So if somebody is coming to me and saying, hey, I've heard about this mindfulness thing, I'm really interested in learning more about it. I want to practice more. I have this time, this period in my life where I can actually dedicate some energy towards this, where would you recommend I start? At that point, if that's where a person is at, then I would say start with the UW Health Mindfulness Program. It's extremely well developed, as 26-year history plus at this point in time. There are some sort of entry-level foundational courses that we have, which are the MBSR course, as well as a Mindful Awareness Practice course, which is a 6-week course that sort of set the stage for a long-term mindfulness practice. And there is a multitude of different other courses that are offered through the mindfulness program to really, again, meet people where they're at. So I had mentioned before the mindfulness-based childbirth and parenting course. There's a mindfulness for people of color course, mindfulness course in Spanish, talking about mindfulness in motion course, mindful photography, mindfulness in aging. That's really a really great resource if people are local in Madison.
And of course, some of those programs I'm sure are available in other places in the country and the world. Mindfulness-based stress reduction is a well-known program that I know other institutions have. I wonder what you would say to this, because a lot of people ask me about online programs or phone apps or other opportunities that they can do from home. How do you feel about those?
I think they can be really helpful. I think it could be very supportive for people. And again, it's another way to sort of explore, investigate, discover mindfulness practice in a way that fits with where you're at right now in your life. So for some people that I see in clinic, they're like, hey, I'm interested in mindfulness. I'm interested in an app in particular. And so if there are apps that people are interested in, I'll often share some ones that I think are well done. Would be Headspace, Calm, CALM, Buddhify is another good one. Another one that comes out of the VA hospital system, which is free to use, is called Mindfulness Coach. Also very well done app. So that's something that people can sort of tap into from home. I think there are a lot of really wonderfully written books as well, if people are interested. Sometimes, as a sort of starter book for some people, is I will mention John Kabat-Zinn, his book "Wherever You Go, There You Are." That can be an introduction for some people. And again, that's just barely scratching the surface.
Can you clarify for us what we mean by cognitively stimulating activity and social engagement?
Yes. So cognitively stimulating activities are mentally engaging activities that challenge a person's ability to think. So I think the two key concepts there are engaging and challenging. So that's what is referred to as cognitive activity. And then social engagement refers to interactions with other people. And in particular, these interactions with other people should be enjoyable for that person.
Now, is all learning considered cognitively stimulating activity?
I think that not all thinking is cognitively stimulating, but learning new things is cognitively stimulating. So learning a new activity, such as learning a new language, for example, or learning an instrument, or learning a list of words for like a list of grocery items, if you work on memorizing those and then go to the store and pick them up. Those kinds of learning, that is mentally stimulating and engaging.
Now, what studies have been done looking at cognitively stimulating activity and memory?
So there are so many studies that have been done to kind of look at what effect cognitively stimulating activities have on dementia risk in general, but then also on particular cognitive or memory and thinking skills, right? So one in particular that I love to talk about is based on a religious order study or a nun study. And this study was done in 2002 by Wilson and colleagues. And this study looked at nuns and priests who kind of lived in the same exact environment. So the surroundings were the same. A lot of things were the same. Diet might have been similar for that group, and asked questions about cognitively stimulating activities, and did this kind of throughout the nuns and priests' lives. And those who reported doing more cognitively stimulating activities like reading, playing games, those kinds of activities, had a reduced risk of dementia, up to 47% reduced risk of dementia later in life. So it's really compelling, but there are caveats in terms of interpreting that. So they might be doing other things too that we don't know about, right? It also might be that they were, for example, exercising more. So it's really hard to separate out what contributed to that reduced risk, but there's some kind of association with cognitive activity. Other study that I can talk about is a twin study, and that too is very similar in terms of the degree of kind of control we might have. So the twins are genetically similar, so they're very interesting to study, because if one twin has a different outcome, and yet their genetic makeup is very similar, it might be due to an environmental factor, right, like cognitively stimulating activity. And so this study by Carlson and colleagues in 2008 looked at two male twins, and one who ended up developing dementia and one twin who did not, so kind of a subset of these twins, and found again that the twin who engaged in more cognitive activity had a 26% reduced risk of developing dementia than the twin who didn't report that cognitive activity. So kind of really interesting observational studies that we can draw on.
And what about brain games like puzzles, Sudoku, crosswords? Would you consider those cognitively stimulating?
Absolutely, unless, the person is an aficionado on one of those things and it's almost rote to be able to fill one of those out, and it's not stimulating for that particular person. So again, it's an individual effort, engagement kind of activity that we're looking at.
And it's that challenging factor. It really has to push your brain.
Yeah.
So then going back to the social engagement piece, are there studies showing an association of being social with improved thinking abilities?
Yes, and socialization has been harder to study than cognitive activity because it's very difficult to isolate social activity. It's also difficult to do a clinical trial, let's say, on social activity, because you don't want to isolate one group of people and not let them have social contact versus, the other groups. So there's those kinds of inherent problems. But also, social activity is cognitive, so it's very hard to study it by itself. But what we do think is, and studies have shown, is that social engagement leads to happiness and improved well-being, and also dementia risk, a reduced dementia risk in people who report being more socially engaged. So, again, it's hard to tease out what that is, whether it's the well-being or whether it's the cognitive engagement or what, but there is more and more compelling evidence to say that people need to be socially engaged to have a better quality of life.
How are you looking at social isolation? How are you defining social isolation for this study?
Yeah, and that's a great place to start. So, thinking more broadly, this concept of social connectedness. So, there's social isolation, which is more an objective measure of your state of social connectedness. So, things like the number of people in your social network or your living situation or your marital status. It's more of those objective measures. There's also a construct called loneliness, which is a subjective measure, which is more of the perceived aspect of social connectedness. So, how often you feel like you lack companionship, or whether you feel close to people or not, or whether you feel alone. So, when you think about broadly about social connectedness, we commonly think about both social isolation, this objective part, and loneliness, which is a more subjective aspect. In the United States, prevalence of social isolation is high. It's 1 in 4 in older adults report having social isolation.
I really appreciate that definition. I'm seeing more and more the importance of addressing social isolation or talking about social isolation. But then I think to myself, well, how does one know if they're isolated or not? And what if you prefer to not be around as many people? And so hearing the difference between isolation and loneliness, I think is really important. How is social isolation, the objective measure then, related to the development of dementia?
Yeah, and I'll say also that social isolation and loneliness, they're not mutually exclusive. Someone can be social isolated and lonely, or someone can also have many social connections around them, but feel very lonely. In the context of dementia, so, the key finding of this study was that in, a large nationally representative study of older adults in the United States, being socially isolated versus not being socially isolated was associated with 27%, so a nearly 30% higher hazard or higher risk of dementia over 9 years. And this is consistent with much of the prior evidence on this association. A report from the Lancet Commission came out in 2020 looking at 12 modifiable risk factors for dementia, and social isolation was on that list as a late life risk factor for dementia.
Do you have ideas on what the connection could be between social isolation and dementia?
Yeah, so there's a couple mechanisms. So one is through poorer health behavior. So we know that people who are socially isolated tend to have reduced physical activity, tend to be more likely to smoke, have poor diet. This puts these individuals more at risk for other physical and mental health conditions that are associated with dementia risk, like cardiovascular disease or hypertension or depression. And additionally, being socially isolated or less connected to the people around you, these older adults may not benefit as much from social resources like social support and information sharing and care coordination. That all these factors contribute to overall health and could also increase risk for dementia. And in terms of the more physiologic, biologic pathways, we know that social isolation increases stress. And that increased stress response also has negative effects on the brain and brain structure. And we also know social isolation actually has, an effect on upregulation of genes that increase inflammation, which is another vascular risk factor for dementia. So there's some of these more, biological, physiological pathways that could link to dementia. And then in terms of, cognitive explanations, people with reduced social engagement, reduced activity, this kind of leans into the cognitive reserve hypothesis. And what I mean by cognitive reserve, it's this theory that, with greater cognitive reserve, the brain is less susceptible to pathology associated with Alzheimer's and dementia risk. So can more easily, overcome some of those pathologies that can lead to dementia. And ways to increase cognitive reserve are, activity, like cognitive stimulation and keeping the brain active. So with lower social engagement, without that cognitive stimulation from interacting with other people, could play into, not having as much cognitive reserve and leaving the brain a little more vulnerable. And these are a couple, hypothesized pathways that we think, could explain this relationship that we're seeing between social isolation and dementia.
Well, I must say that was a much greater answer than I was anticipating. There seems to be a lot of connections or potential connections between these, and it all makes sense to me. But that the biologic, the social aspect, the
Yeah.
cognitive reserve, I mean, this one area, it shows how important this one area is, but, the need to address it as well. I would like your opinion on how would one go about reducing their risk of social isolation? What should someone do if they feel like they're lonely or socially isolated? What kind of tips or resources would you suggest?
Yeah, it's really hard. If you're socially isolated, if you're feeling lonely, that's really hard on your mental health. And that can be a real challenge to dig out from and to, really feel like you can overcome. But, at the individual level, the simplest thing is to get out there, I think, to, join some community programs or clubs or activities. There are programs that pair younger adults with older adults to encourage, intergenerational, cross-generational socialization. So there are a number of activities or programs that are available to kind of help reduce social isolation in older adults. So things like that are, activities that people could take advantage of. Another way, on the individual level is to really address some of the other health risk factors for social isolation. So, as you mentioned in the introduction, a large part of my work surrounds hearing loss as well. And as you can imagine, having our hearing loss contributes to isolation. With hearing loss, it's more difficult to, communicate with others, more difficult to understand conversations. Treating the hearing loss with, for example, hearing aids could potentially, really make a difference in terms of social connectedness and even confidence in being able to go out and socially engage. So, that's one example, but there's other, types of physical and mental health conditions that lead to social isolation. So, for example, depression or other chronic conditions. So, another way is to kind of address those types of factors at first that could make it easier to engage to reduce isolation.
And I'm back to share some final thoughts. As someone who thinks about risk reduction for dementia, personally and professionally, I find the evidence compelling that lifestyle interventions are meaningful and impactful. There's no guarantee that doing everything perfectly means you won't develop disease later in life. However, it is empowering to have some influence in your future and in how you feel. We are not solely our genetics or the proteins that could be building in our brains. Our actions, or rather our habits and behaviors, mean something, for better or for worse. I believe in the 6 pillars of brain health and try to incorporate them as much as I can. The pillars are incomplete, but they are a good part of the foundation. Other factors, such as addressing hearing, vision, and oral hygiene, matter. Certainly, addressing vascular factors like high blood pressure, high blood sugar, high cholesterol, obesity, and smoking are going to be meaningful. Inflammation, environmental exposures, and even our personality traits likely impact cognition and open up the possibilities for researchers to investigate more ways for us to be healthier and live longer. I'm excited and grateful. To wrap up, I want to give a quick thank you to our guests, not only from the interviews we've highlighted here, but all of the guests who have ever joined us on the show. I appreciate them taking the time to chat a bit about the work they're doing in research, in clinical trials, in community outreach, and more, so it can be shared with all of you listening. I also want to thank you at home for listening. As a team, we appreciate all your support when you listen or send emails with ideas or feedback, and we hope you continue to come back and learn more about the work being done related to Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. If you'd like to learn more about how these 6 pillars can impact brain health and memory, particularly social engagement, please join us at the Wisconsin ADRC's Fall Community Conversation on September 10th, 2024, from 4:30 to 7:30 p.m. at the Middleton Performing Arts Center in Dane County, Wisconsin. The theme of the event is the impact of social connections on brain health, and will include a healthy aging resource fair, refreshments, presentations from a number of faculty members from the University of Wisconsin, and a Q&A session with the evening's presenters. More information on the event and how to register can be found at our website at adrc.wisc.edu/FCC 2024 or in the show notes. And if you're listening after September 10th, you'll be able to find a recording of the event on our YouTube page. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I hope you live your best life. Thank you for listening to Dementia Matters. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. or tell your smart speaker to play the Dementia Matters podcast. Please rate us on your favorite podcast app. It helps other people find our show and lets us know how we're doing. If you enjoy our show and want to support our work, consider making a gift to the Dementia Matters Fund through the UW Initiative to End Alzheimer's. All donations go toward outreach and production. Donate at the link in the description. Dementia Matters is brought to you by the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It receives funding from private, university, state, and national sources, including a grant from the National Institutes on Aging for Alzheimer's Disease Research. This episode of Dementia Matters was produced by Amy Lambright Murphy and Kaylin Rauerdink and edited by Kaylin Rauerdink. Our musical jingle is Cases to Rest by Blue Dot Sessions. To learn more about the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, check out our website at adrc.wisc.edu. That's adrc.wisc.edu. And follow us on Facebook and Twitter. If you have any questions or comments, email us at dementiamatters@medicine.wisc.edu. Thanks for listening.